collectively agree we're not going to ask you for a Super Bowl prediction.
Now, okay, here's my Super Bowl prediction. Cubs and Rangers, if you're going to ask.
Oh, wow. You already have one.
This is After Hours with Amy Lawrence.
From my most recent appearance on CBS This Morning on a Saturday with Vanita Nair, that's the female's voice you heard, and the boisterous laugh of Anthony Mason, who has become one of my favorite people in news. And yes, I am biased. Not just because he works for CBS, but because I really enjoy spending time on set with he and Vanita. Typically, I am the one on the hot seat, nervous, getting peppered with their questions about sports. We are turning the tables. I'm very excited to have Anthony with us here on After Hours with Amy Lawrence on CBS Sports Radio and CBSSportsRadio.com. So, Anthony, it's great to have you. I know that you've been so wrapped up in election coverage and then the post and the fallout and all of that jazz. But going back to election night, which is now 3 weeks away, what was it like for you as someone who's an experienced newsman and to go through that, realizing at some point that it was going to be Donald Trump topping Hillary Clinton?
Well, it's always one of the most suspenseful nights, in your career. I mean, I've done exit polling. I can't even remember how far back I started. It's at least 2000. I think it might have even been before that. So I've done it a bunch of times. And I was an election nut as a kid. I used to work on political campaigns. So I've always loved the excitement of an election night. So I'm always up for it and excited. And, of course, going in, we started getting the first exit poll numbers around 5 p.m. And those numbers had turned out to be somewhat misleading. So we were, we knew it was going to be really, really close. But I don't think there were indications early on that the Electoral College was going to go the way it did. And so we were, frankly, based on the exit polls, we were surprised. We had rehearsed both outcomes, by the way. We the weekend before the election, we did full rehearsals in which we would declare a winner, and we rehearsed both outcomes. So it's not, when you do that, you sort of mentally get yourself prepared for both things. It's very strange to rehearse with essentially fake numbers, but when you go through that process and you call a winner, you have to believe it while you're doing it. Even if it's only for 45 seconds or 3 minutes, whatever it is.
On election night, it certainly seemed like many of the news organizations and their figureheads were astonished at how things were playing out. So considering the fact that you rehearsed with CBS, Anthony, is that something that helped you better manage and navigate what actually played out?
Well, yes, there's no question they were, and I think a lot of that had to do with projections that had been made by certain polling organizations that had put the likelihood of a Clinton victory, extremely high. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, these are reputable groups. They've looked at all this information and this is what they see. So there was genuine shock on the night. I was really glad I generally hate the rehearsals for the very reason that it kind of confuses you when you play with. For the sake of rehearsing, they make up artificial numbers so you can run through scenarios. And when you get to the actual night a few days later, you still have those numbers in your head and you have to flush them out because, as they say, you have to pretend they're real. But I was very glad I rehearsed because in the end, you open your mind up and you suddenly go, okay, there actually is a whole range of things here. Ignore all these things everybody's saying. This could go either way.
Those rehearsals came in handy for election night. Now we are 3 weeks removed from Donald Trump winning the Electoral College and becoming president-elect. How much do you think the storylines and kind of the domino effect has continued to drive the news cycle since?
Oh, there's no question it's still driving the news cycle, and I think it's going to drive the news cycle for quite a while. Because I think this is going to turn out to be an historic election. Well, every election is historic. Let's say that out front. But this is going to be a particularly historic election because of what happened. I mean, just to start with, in the fact that Trump wins the Electoral College, but Clinton looks like she's going to end up winning the popular vote by 2.5 million votes. So you can't have a country sort of more clearly divided down the middle as this one is now. It was before, and there's so much sort of inherent friction there. And now you have a businessman as president who's never had held elective office, who's playing his own game. He's not playing the traditional Washington game, and it's throwing a lot of people off, including a lot of people in the media.
That certainly is good for business. And Anthony Mason is the co-host of CBS This Morning on Saturday and Sunday. I always enjoy being part of that show when I get invited. He's a CBS News senior national correspondent as well, and it's After Hours with Amy Lawrence on CBS Sports Radio. I'm sure that TV news faces some of the same challenges as sports radio. Different viewing and listening habits, plus the advent of social media, Anthony. So how do you like the way that media has morphed now into 2016?
Well, listen. I'm a Twitter junkie. I got sort of pushed into it by some of my colleagues and did it reluctantly. But I love getting a stream of information on Twitter. It's how I sort of keep myself on the front edge of things. But I also need something that's ultimately more satisfying, I should say. It's like, those are the hors d'oeuvres, if you will. I need the main course at some point. And I think, there's such a shift. There's so many shifts going on concurrently. But I think the key thing is if you tell a good story, it will find an audience. And by that, I mean, I think more important than ever, with so many people delivering up information, it's how you tell a story that really is going to matter. And that's something that I know I talk to a lot of my colleagues about, because there's so many people who are now offering news, or, if you will, their take on, whatever other people are reporting in the news. So that's something that we work really hard on the Saturday show, is giving you something that goes a little bit further than what everybody else does, so that when you've spent, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes with us, whatever it is, hopefully even more, you walk away feeling like you got more value for your time invested than you thought you were gonna.
All right, so that's about the most news and politics we'll ever talk on the show in your honor, Anthony. Though it was pretty amazing to be on the air the night the election was called. That never had happened in my career. I know from being on the set with you at CBS This Morning and from following you on Twitter that you are a huge music buff, and you're constantly getting a chance to interview new and old acts, or classic acts. So what is the recent interview or interaction that you've had that's kind of blown you away?
Well, I have to tell you, they're all special, and I don't mean that in a sort of a pandering kind of way. I have such a good time talking to musicians. I'm still not exactly sure why, but I think it's there's just something about the creative process and the magic that is music that fascinates me, and why a song, suddenly gets under the skin of an entire country and, stays there for 30 or 40 years. I just love the stories behind the creation of songs. And so, I've got a piece coming up on Sunday morning with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards on their new blues album. And it's the first time I talked to Mick Jagger, and, it doesn't get any more exciting than that, right? I mean, and I just came back from Chicago, where I was talking to Mavis Staples of the famous Staples Singers family. She's getting a Kennedy Center Honors Award, and she's had an extraordinary life. She was a gospel singer when she was, a teenager, and then marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and then had hit records all through the 70s. And at 75, she's still going. I could talk to these people for days.
Those are great reasons to tune in to CBS This Morning on Saturday and Sunday, where Anthony is co-host with Vanita Nair, who is one of my faves. So let's talk about sports a little bit. Anthony, you're a native New Yorker, which I'm just finding out. Who are the teams that you root for?
I'm a New York Mets fan first, a New York Knicks fan second. I've never really been a football fan, which is kind of weird, but it's just always the way I've been. I started out as I guess my dad, who had gone to Princeton, took me to my first college basketball game at the old Madison Square Garden because Bill Bradley was playing, and he was my hero as a kid. And I remember because it was a Princeton-Syracuse game, and Dave Bing was playing for Syracuse, so that takes you way back. But that's what got me into the Knicks, because when Bradley went to the Knicks, I became a diehard Knicks fan. My bedtime was 10 o'clock, I think, back when I was about 12 or 13. But the Knicks games usually ended about 10:15 or 10:20. So I would tuck my transistor radio under my pillow to hide it and turn it down as low as I could and still hear it. And I had this very intimate relationship with Marv Albert back then, who was, I think, like a 20-year-old Knicks play-by-play guy. But that's how I became a Knicks fan, was literally, under the pillow at night. And it was like perfect timing, because it was like 1966, 67. I was 10, 11, and by 69, of course, they were winning the championship. So I came in, at a great time, and I became a Mets fan because my stepfather, my mother married my stepfather in 1964, and he was commissioned. He's a painter, and he was commissioned to do paintings of the Mets for the Diamond Club when Shea Stadium opened. So right after they got married, Casey Stengel came to our house to see these paintings with Joan Payson, who owned the Mets. And when you're 8 years old and Casey Stengel comes to your house, it's a pretty darn big deal.
So with all of those experiences, did you ever consider a career in sports broadcasting?
Well, that was one of the things. I mean, when I was a kid, I was broadcasting everything. I mean, I did newscasts, sportscasts in my room. Anytime I was if I was playing Nerf ball on the back of my closet, because I had a whole basketball league, and I did the play-by-play for all the games. And when I got to college at Georgetown, there was a very low wattage AM station, and we used to call the Georgetown games. This was like about 2 or 3 years before Patrick Ewing got there and made things really big. But the hardest thing I ever did, and this is when I really understood how tough sportscasting is, was there was a tennis tournament that was being held in the gym that year with some pretty top-level talent, and we decided to broadcast it. And it was only when we started to do it did I realize I'd never heard – I don't think I've ever heard a radio tennis broadcast. I didn't know what it sounded like. And so I had there was no roadmap for doing it, and it just completely freaked me out. Because in broadcasting basketball games, I had Marv Albert in the back of my head because I'd been listening to him forever. So it was my broadcast was sort of my mimicry of Marv Albert. But when I was broadcasting, have you ever heard tennis on the radio?
Oh, it's really hard to follow on the radio.
It was so strange, but I was like, I will never forget that day because I had to make it up entirely. And that's when I was like, all right, now I understand how hard this job actually is.
I mean, compared to being a senior national correspondent for CBS News and anchoring CBS This Morning, yeah, broadcasting tennis play-by-play may be a little more difficult. Anthony, it's so good to have a couple of minutes where I get to ask you the questions, since I'm usually the one who's getting peppered with the questions on the set of your show. Thank you so much for a couple of minutes. It's been great to have you.
It's been a real pleasure, Amy. Thank you. Take care.